Hi everyone, and welcome to this session of the PhenoLab. Today is my great pleasure to have with us Professor Sara Heinämaa, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Jyväskylä and docent of Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Helsinki in Finland. Sara is specialized in phenomenology, existentialism, philosophy of mind, and history of philosophy, and has published extensively in these fields, especially on normativity, values, emotions, embodiment, personhood, intersubjectivity, and gender. She is an expert of Husserlian phenomenology, but also has contributed broadly to our understanding of existential phenomenology and its methods, especially of the philosophies of Merleau-Ponty, Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre, and Levinas. Professor Heinämaa is co-author of Birth, Death, and Femininity, published in 2010, and author of Toward the Phenomenology of Sexual Difference, published in 2003, and has co-edited several volumes, including Contemporary Phenomenologies of Normativity, Norms, Goals, and Values, 2022, Why Methods Matters, Phenomenology as Critique, 2022, Phenomenology and the Transcendental, 2014, which was fantastic, if I may add, and Consciousness, published in 2007. Sara, thank you very much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and still again apologize for everyone for my complete mixture with the earlier date. So I was just overworking and had mixed days, and I'm so happy and honored that you're here today, and forgive my mistake. As you know, the title is Depth and Transitivity on the Intentional and Egoic Structures of Love. So my topic is love, and it really stays with love and emotions mainly. And the framing is Husserl's ethics. So I'm going to ask how the emotion of love and what kind of an emotional love has a central place in Husserl's later mature ethics. So not the early ethics from the early 1910, but the later ethics that he develops in the 20s, where he moves by the guidance of his analysis of emotions and also volition. So how the will works, these kind of guide his reflections on how he should refine and also renew his own earlier ethics. So I have slides, so I will share the slides, but I also will read the paper. So I'm not so, I'm a little kind of, this is new, the paper is new, so I'm not so completely, how would I say, I can't remember it all, so I will read it rather than speak it freely. But I hope you're not bored, at least you can see the slides. So I tried to share the slides now. I hope this works. Can you see them now? Okay, good. And I hope it's in the mode that is more accessible, the larger mode. Okay, so some of the slides give you quotes from Husserl, and some of the slides give you short kind of analyses, packages of how to kind of structure what he's saying. And I think there are more quotes than the analysis, but let's see. So I will start reading the paper. Husserl's late discourse on love and values of love, so what he calls Liebeswerte, is part of his phenomenological account of intentional emotions and their passive grounds in non-intentional feelings, drives, and sensations. This account is not a branch of Husserl's phenomenological psychology or a division of his phenomenological anthropology merely. It's also a central development and extension of his philosophical theory of persons and personal wholes. Instituted in the 20s in the second volume of Ideas, systemized, I think, in Cartesian meditations and related manuscripts, and then further elaborated to the very last writings in the 1930s. So I think it's both a part of his phenomenological psychology, it's also part of his phenomenological anthropology, but the basis is in a philosophical theory of persons, which is a little kind of larger than the psychological and anthropological parts. Husserl's philosophy of persons is a transcendental eidetic study in its method, I believe. It illuminates the actual lives and coexistence of human persons, but it also proceeds to investigate into the conditions of possibility of all conceivable persons in toto. The most important examples of his reconceptualization are not among infantile, animal, artificial, and extraterrestrial or divine persons, not only these, but are in the open-ended organizations of individuals that he calls personalities of higher order. So personaliteten der högre ordnung. Such higher order personalities include nations, cultures, states, federations, churches, and religious communities. So these are examples of such personal wholes. But also the universe. Now somebody, perhaps the microphone, at least I hear somebody's microphone.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay, but I just kind of thought that you wanted to add something. But the examples are, so among the churches, religious communities, federations, states, and cultures, but also the universal communities of sciences and arts. Even social classes, genders, races, or other so-called identity categories may be analyzable as personalities of higher order insofar as they are constituted by their own members in communicatively shared acts of valuing and willing, and are not simply produced by social historical forces and circumstances. So insofar as the members are committed to the community, they might be analyzed. So also the identity categories might be analyzed as personalities of higher order. But if these identity categories are merely products of historical forces, social historical forces, then they wouldn't operate in this Husserlian sense, and we couldn't analyze them. On the basis of his concepts of value of love and personhood and personalities of higher order, Husserl then gives us an understanding of what he means by communities of love, of community of life, several communities or one community of love. So these three conceptual layers, or conceptual parts go hand in hand. They allow one to understand what he means by the other. The ethical idea of such higher level personalities of higher order for Husserl is the community of love, in which all members are actively united by some symmetrical and transitive relations of love. And these relations involve both emotion and will. So they are united by feeling and willing. But by this regulative idea, Husserl, I think, reinterprets the Christian notion of neighborly love. I think this is a reinterpretation. And he also concretizes his own discussions of what he calls non-revelational rational faith. This mereological ground, the mereological ground of this renewal of Christianity, or one Christian idea, lies, I believe, in his Leibnizian social ontology, that is, in his monadology. But the idea is also informed in his interest in Stoic and Kantian cosmopolitanism. So this idea of a community of love is kind of grounded in his monadology, which has Leibnizian kind of ring to it. But I think he also is kind of inspired by this Stoic and Kantian idea of cosmopolitanism, which is a kind of unity that enlarges in circular form and is able to encompass more and more members. For systematic and methodological purposes, it is important to realize that Husserl's discourse on personal love and love between persons primarily contributes to his transcendental eidetic inquiries into the essential structures of all possible value intending and willing. So this is part of his axiology as a theory of value intending, valuing, and his praxeology, which is his theory of willing and volition. When proceeding in his inquiries into love, he observed that several inherited presumptions and habitual convictions about emotions and the values intended in emotions are untenable in light of the demands of his transcendental or transcendentally radicalized critique. He thus came to think that the cornerstone of his earlier ethics, which was in axiology, must be reworked, must be restudied, must be renewed. More precisely, the analytical results of his investigations into personal love urge him to reconsider the adequacy of the axiological principles of his early ethics, and I will explain what he questioned. The values that he started to study in the late 10s and 20s, which he called values of love, are disclosed by individual subjects, persons, but their subjective disclosure does not make them relative. Rather, they disclose themselves as absolute and place unconditional obligations on persons. They are not objectifiable, not comparable with or to other values, and thus they defy the axiological laws which organize values into hierarchies of priority and preference. So the values that he found in the 20s, he claims, are not comparable to other values, and no comparisons can find them positions in value hierarchies of priority and preference. They command us absolutely. They demand absolute active realizations. Finally, the demands of these values place the demands that these values place on our actions and forms of agency can be disobeyed. So there are circumstances, situations in which several values of love conflict, and we have to obey their obligations in order to obey the obligation of some others. However, such disobedience cannot lead, Husserl argues, to any restoration or inner balance. Instead, each such disobedience to an absolutely commanding value leads to permanent sadness and grief in our lives. So when we disobey the commands of these values that are personally significant to us, we may be able to then realize the commands of the values later, but we can't get rid of the sadness and grief that the disobedience brings with it in each case. So Husserl's late studies of the emotion of love and his conceptualization of values of love as correlates of acts of genuine loving challenged several assumptions on which his own axiology rested, his own earlier axiology rested. This forced him to rework his ethics and abandon some of its basic assumptions about valuations and values. So my claim would be that, my claim is that his study on the emotions of values has rather far-reaching implications to his ethics. And I try to show some of those implications, especially to his reinterpretation of Kant's and Brentanon's categorical imperative, so formulations of the categorical imperative. So this is one very concrete implication that his inquiries into love then brought with them. But that I will end with the discussion of the imperative. Perhaps one point about just kind of side remark about his ethics, early ethics, is that it rested on an analogy between logic and ethics. So he kind of believed that rational scientific ethics can be developed in a similar manner as one can develop logic. And this meant for him that ethics, like logic, is a descriptive theoretical science in its fundamental ground, which studies certain idealities, values, like logic studies certain other idealities, propositions and propositional relations. So both sciences are normative merely secondarily. They are primarily, so fundamentally, they are descriptive theoretical sciences. We can then derive normative practical statements from the theoretical ground. But the practical normative depends on the theoretical descriptive. But then when he found the values of love, he realized that his analogy between logic and ethics and his axiology, early axiology, rested on an assumption about values. And he realized that his early axiology rested on the assumption that all values are objectifiable or objectifiable in a similar manner. But what he then calls absolute values of love can't be objectified in the same manner as some other values can be. They can't be compared, and they can't be separated from their subjective roots as other values can be. And this leads to a kind of an analysis of how they then might be conflict, how they in some certain circumstances have to be sacrificed, and how that sacrifice then gives us or leads us to a permanent state of sadness and grief. So the early ethics was developed mainly in an analogy between logic and ethics, and this he had to restrict, not abandon, but restrict when he proceeded in his study of values. Another thing that I want to remind you about, and it's probably very familiar to you, but I need it in order to say more about values of love, is the three type of analyses that with which he operates. He distinguishes types of intending or acts of intending into three kinds. So doxic intending, axiological intending, and conative intending, or practical intending. And whereas we posit being in different senses in our doxic acts, so being as real, being as present, being as absent, being as probable, and so on, we posit value in axiological acts and axiological intention. And we posit goals in conative life. And the examples, the main examples of doxic intendings are perceptions and cognitions. Here we have as examples valuations and feelings, and in conative realm, voliation and willing. So this you should keep in mind, because he argues about these relations of such acts in emotion quite specifically. He also puts forward, and this might be very familiar to you, but I mentioned this, two what he calls theses of foundedness. He argues that axiological acts are founded on doxic acts, and conative acts, so practical acts of goal positing, are founded on axiological acts of valuing, which then further are then grounded in some kinds of doxic acts. So in common sense terms, you can't posit a goal unless you have some kind of value already operative. You have to value something in order to have a goal. So this depends on this. And in order to posit a goal value, you have to have some kind of a world in which there are objects that might somehow carry value. So in very kind of common sense terms, goals depend on values and values depend on some kind of being. And this is what he operates with in these distinctions. So I continue now, and I go now to the emotions and the foundedness of love, how it is founded. for our purposes, so purposes of being interested in emotions and love in specific, the most important thing to notice about Husserl's thesis about founding of axiological acts is that the doxic foundation of emotion does not have to be a reality. I think this is most important. We don't value mere realities, really things, real events, real processes, or any realities. So all valuing does not have to deal with realities. Many important types of doxic acts, other types of doxic acts that give us realities, can also operate as founding for emotions. For example, imagined and memorized objects, which were real. So remembered objects, they were real, but they are not real anymore. Imagined objects, they are not real at all. They can found emotions. We can value completely imagined objects, and we can also value past objects. More interestingly, we can also value purely ideal objects, and these can operate as intentional foundations in emotion. And finally, emotion can also be founded on mere appearances. So not realities, but mere appearances. We can, for example, and this is just a concrete example, be struck by the beauty of a rainbow or the northern lights, while intending them as pure appearances, without positing them as realities. We can find them beautiful and even be struck by their beauty. And on the other hand, we can admire the elegancy of a mathematical proof, which is an ideal object and not a real one. So the main idea is that emotions are not only about realities, but much broader sets of objects. This means that we can emotionally be related and value persons, actions, things, events, appearances, actualities and possibilities, realities and idealities. So the sphere of love potentiality is huge. Unlike actions, emotions are not bound to realities. Thus, they can be said to be relatively open-minded about their foundations. This implies that if we want to study phenomenologically the emotion of love, we must not restrict ourselves to actual or real objects merely. Imaginary objects and ideal ones are equally important for theorizing the emotion of love. Even if we ourselves would not be able to love God or any divinities at all, or even if we wouldn't understand anybody who loves God, we should still not exclude such experiences from our phenomenological investigations of the emotion of love. So the mystical erotic emotions and feeling states that, for example, Ludovica had about Christ and God, or Teresa of Avila, as well as the sentiments that psychotic or schizophrenic individuals such as Daniel Paul Schreber had in respect to God, or another challenged person, so mentally challenged person, John Hinckley Jr., had in respect to Jodie Foster, are all relevant to our studies, our eidetic studies of love. So the pathological examples equally as the non-pathological ones. And these are examples from the pathological cases. This is a small note that John Hinckley wrote to Jodie Foster, where he wrote, "I love you 6 trillion times. Don't you maybe like me a little bit? And then you must admit that I'm different. I would make all the difference." So I just show these in order to kind of remind you that, and of course you know this, that when we are trying to do an eidetic inquiry into the emotion or into emotion of love, the abnormal cases as well as the normal ones, the imaginary cases as well as the real ones, are equally important, not less important, but equally important. Furthermore, completely fictional cases and distant historical ones are equally important. So here is Elua and Abelard. Here are The Beauty and the Beast and Vronsky and Anna Karenina. Everything, all of this is equally important. Thus, what Husserl writes about eidetic inquiries in Ideas 1 really captures what we must try to do when we are going into the realm of emotions. He writes in Ideas 1, extraordinary profit can be drawn from the offering of history and even more from those of arts, and especially from poetry, which are, to be sure, fruits of imagination, but which in the ordinary, in the originality of formation, the abundance of detailed features, and unbrokenness of motivation tower higher above the products of our own fantasy. And then he goes on and says, all eidetic sciences similarly depend on imagination as phenomenology. So not only phenomenology, but geometry as well. If you kind of have a courageous mind, he says in a little like kind of joking tone. Most concrete experiences entail all three types of intending, so doxic, axiological, and conative. But even if these types are entangled in our lives, intentional lives, we can and must conceptually distinguish between them. And this distinguishing allows us to understand then what happens in what Husserl calls full-grown, genuine love. In his analysis, it is an emotional state that is governed by axiological acts of value intending, but also entails necessarily a conative act of committing oneself to caring for the loved one, as well as for one's own capacity to love. So genuine love entails a volition which binds you to the project of caring for the beloved one, and another kind of a commitment which binds you to caring for your own capacity to love. Thus analyzed, full-grown love also entails a volition and is not simply composed of intentional feeling. Moreover, as all axiological acts, also acts of loving are founded on some doxic grounds or other. In this perspective, love in this genuine sense, in this pregnant kind of full-grown sense, is a complex combination of axiological, conative, and doxic acts. Despite this richness, it's an emotional experience par excellence, since a set of axiological acts, not conative or doxic ones, governs its main directedness and regard of objectivity. Further, unlike other positive emotions and feeling states, such as respect and joy, for example, love, in this pregnant sense, discloses positive values within infinite horizons of endlessness and endlessly widening possibilities of realization. So there is an infinity built in genuine love, he argues, which correlates by the subjective ground of such love, which he claims is infinite. So there are infinite sources of love in subjectivity. And the infinity of these realizing acts, where you realize the value of the beloved one, correlate with the infinity of the feeling that pours from you. That's the main correlative idea. He calls value of love the values that such emotions are able to detect in the world. So detecting those values depends on our capacities of feeling, and then directing volition by this feeling. So values of love differ in several crucial respects from objective values, which can be values that can be objectified, so separated from their sources and presented as objects, and shared as objects. Values of love are personal in a fundamental sense that the acts that constitute their meanings emerge from the deepest cores of egos, egoic persons. As such, they are able to regulate not just individual actions and action types, but personal lives as comprehensive wholes. So such values not just regulate actions as they come individually in our lives, they are able to regulate life as a whole of active relating. As pointed out already, Husserl's threefold analysis shows that loving is not composed of one feeling, axiological act merely, neither value perception nor value judgment, but has a more complex structure. An unbound stream of feeling and value intending issues from the deepest axiological core of the self, the person, and in a certain very specific way, such that it commits the ego to the beloved one in volition. Volition guided by the feeling, commits to the beloved one and the possibilities and future of the beloved one, also its past. So commits to the beloved one as a whole with the past and the future. We're committed to a whole. What is at issue in this manner of intending is a deep and deeply egoic power, and moreover such that it individuates the ego, distinguishes the ego as a specific kind of lover from all other lovers possible. In one manuscript, Husserl writes, "I am who I am," and the individual specificity shows itself in that I love as I am who I am, exactly as I love, that exactly this one calls me, and not that one, that other. So my individuality is manifested, he argues, in my manner of relating to beloved ones, which differs from the other person, how he relates to his beloved ones. Thus understood, values of love are not comparable with other values as objectively given and are not insertable into objectively value hierarchies. They oblige the valuing person absolutely and unconditionally, and not only on the condition that they are isolated from some other values, or on the condition that other values are suspended. So their absolute obligation kind of cannot be suspended situationally so that we could listen to the calls of the other values. If I love somebody, I can't as if put him aside and then do something else and then go back to the love later. The love frames my life completely all the time. I can try to then balance different loves, but I can't suspend them in a manner in which I can suspend objective values. This implies that Husserl's concept of personally established love values, that is, personal values, is broader than the traditional category of moral values. It entails much more than altruistic values of generosity and kindness, or the equalitarian values of harmony, equality, respect, and tolerance. More importantly, also epistemic and aesthetic values, as well as the uniquely individual values characteristic of singular persons, are among values of love. As such, the category of love values is morally neutral. However, all personal values of love can, in Husserl's account, be renewed and re-established as ethical values when subjected to radical self-critique and the demand of evidence. So we can, his point is that we are lovers by nature. Humans are able to love and they love differently. But all these loves can be, by radical self-critique and demand of evidence, be ethically renewed, reformed. And this implies that we can live both ethically and non-ethically in our loves. As an example, both artists and scientists can practice their professions either in naive forgetfulness or in ethically reawakened lovers, or whatever they might love. And the example here is the artist. This is from the Kaiser essays. He writes, so art is a vocation for a genuine artist. So a vocation grounded in values of love. Science is a vocation for a true scientist. So two different loves. One loves beauty and harmony or whatever art values there might be. The other one loves truth, distinctiveness, preciseness, rigor, or whatever love values there might be in science. So two different loves and two vocations. And then he says, it is the field, so the vocation is a field of spiritual activities and accomplishments for which she or he knows that she or he has a calling. So that only the pursuit of these goods can give her or him the most inner and most pure satisfaction. And its succeeding can give her the consciousness of happiness. So this is the vocation. But then he says, the true artist as such is not yet a genuine human being in the highest sense. A genuine human being can, however, be a true artist, but can be such only if ethical self-regulation demands this from him. So the artist, the scientist, the parent who loves a child, the erotically related person who loves another person in both spiritual and bodily way, can all as if renew their loves by subjecting that valuing to self-critique, which demands evidence and evidencing. And he believes that this is possible, such an ethical renewal is possible. So personal values ground vocations and organize our lives into vocational wholes. The ethical imperatives that Husserl spells out in the Kaiser essays, which are in a tradition of Kant, so Kantian, Brentanian imperative, kinds of imperatives, concern such wholes already structured by personal values of love and organized into vocational projects and sets of tasks. This means that an ethical way of living can be established only on the basis of a self-regulating vocational love grounded in personal love, and cannot be composed on individually regulated actions in abstraction. So the ethical command concerns, in the Kaiser essays and later in the 20s, a life already organized by values of love into a vocational whole. In his later lectures on ethics, the same idea is then reformulated and repeated many times. He writes, my whole life lies in front of me. And in front of me lies a surrounding world which extends itself around me. What I can accomplish there operates as a basis for my deliberation. And the best that I can accomplish there now and in the future is my obligation, the obligation of the individual, so the ethical obligation. So he formulates the ethical obligation, ethical imperative, on the basis, it concerns a life that is already organized into a vocational whole, grounded in values of love. This then is kind of the middle term formulation for the command, the imperative. But when his inquiries in love proceeded, he came to question even these formulations, and then said that they have to be, such formulation have to be studied in a critical manner, especially in respect to their coverage. We have to ask if such formulation are able to cover all possible situations in which questions about good and bad may arise. And he says actually such formulations can't cover all cases. They are limited to beneficial situations. And I try to tell you fast how he then argues. Would I have 15 minutes to go still, or 10 or 5?
No, you can use 15 minutes. Sara.
Okay. So then yes, okay, great. Because I want to kind of now argue how this is the middle, this is from the 20s, I think 4 or 5, 20s in any case. So you can see here a formulation for the ethical command or obligation, which concerns a life already organized in a vocational way. But when his investigations into love values proceeded, he came to think that this is not adequate. I show you a couple of more formulations from that period. And you can see in all that these formulations operate by the idea of the best possible that can be done in respect to one's capacities in given situations. So the command is that I must do the best that is possible for me in the given conditions, given my capacities. And the ethical is to decide to do always the best that I can. And to grasp what is best in norm cognition and to will it in norm-conscious volition. So this is what I would call his kind of transition period formulations. But I want to show you that when the love inquiries proceeded, he came to think that this is not enough for a full ethics, or this is inadequate. And I show you some quotes in order to show you that he came to question this, but then I show you a case study by which he argued that it has to be questioned. So here he, in Husserliana 42, which is a Grenzproblemen volume, he explicitly argues that the Brentanian rule that operates by the best possible action and the volition to will the best possible and to commit oneself to the best possible is inadequate. He writes, the Brentanian rule is insufficient. Each human being has his or her absolute ought, and her or his choice is carried out in the question, what ought I? And when I ought to do several, then the question would be, which is now my necessary? Not simply which is better in a comparison of the goods. And this is kind of the caricature of the Brentanian formulation. So we are not only asking which is better in comparison to the given goods, but what should I do now? What is the kind of the indexical necessity at this moment? And he gives an example. Playing a sonata by Mozart is more beautiful now than washing the child. But the latter is a duty, since now is its time. Not because it's better in some value comparison, not that there is a hierarchy in which the sonata is higher than the child, or the child is higher than the sonata, or the playing and the washing. Not because there would be a comparison that would tell us that do this rather than that, but because it's now the time. And then he says, the whole ethics of the highest practical good as developed by Brentano, and which I accepted in its essential features earlier, cannot be the last word. It requires basic limitations. It does not do justice to vocation and inner calling in love. So this is one formulation of the claim, but I show you how he then thinks through it, and then we can discuss if the thinking through is convincing or if one has to kind of stick to the concepts of best possible. Husserl backs up his insight by discussing agentive cases in which the Brentanian imperative turns out to be empty or futile or inadequate. For genuine ethics, he claims, it's not sufficient to study habitual, ordinary situations in which our value comparisons operate nicely, or cases that occur in profitable and fortunate circumstances. Instead, ethics, for him, as a rigorous reflection, demands that we also cover limit cases. And he gives us one example of such a limit case. For this, he asked us first to imagine this utopic situation in which all prospects of accomplishing anything good or better or best, so all hopes to accomplish something good, better or best are lost, and lost forever. To be sure, such a hopeless world is far from our normal agentive setting. But it's not an impossibility, nor completely foreign to us. Our collective experiences in the 20th century in the wake of Somme and Verdun, Dachau, Treblinka, the gulags, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Ruanda, Guantanamo and Xinjiang. So it's not that we can't imagine such situations, or not that we couldn't concretize such situations. Perhaps also some pathological cases inform us about such dystopic framings. Husserl then imaginatively inserts two different kinds of agents in this dystopic apocalyptic situation in which all prospects of achieving anything good, better are lost. One agent is what he calls a performance machine, or an achievement machine, Leistungsmaschine, who unhesitantly follows the Brentanian rule of always doing and aiming to do the good, the best, practically possible, the best that he can. So he has this kind of rule system, and he's able to, he's kind of internalized it. He's able to operate in this manner. The other agent is a parent. And for him, the example for him is a mother who knows the Brentanian imperative, but in addition to it is able to follow the personal obligation of loving and lovingly caring for her beloved ones. Husserl's argument is that in such an extreme situation, the performance machine would be paralyzed by futile comparisons, since none of the possible actions that it can imagine and frame or envision would present itself as better than the others, and no best one among them can be identified. The mother, in contrast, he argues, would act immediately, since no change in the situational parameters changes her loving obligation. Here are some other complaints about Brentano. I read them and then I show you what the mother tells us in this dystopic world, what he tells us about the mother. So he says, all these ethics of supreme practical good as developed by Brentano, and in which, and in which I broadly accept it, cannot represent the last word. It requires basic limitation. It does not do justice to vocation and inner calling. So that I think we Yeah, it's just the end of here. But also it is obvious that an ethics which is carried out according to the mere categorical imperative, like it was following Brentano, taken as a basis here, is not ethics at all. And then he continues. But I show you the later then reflection on the mother in a dystopic world. He writes, it may be and may be certain that the world is destined to destruction and the humankind develops without progress, without becoming better. So this is his manner of describing the dystopia. So the world is destined to destruction and there's developing humankind, but with no progress. Everything becomes worse or stays at best the same. But 1,000 times more certain is that I'm not abandoning my child. I should lovingly care for the child. Also that the child's bodily and spiritual becoming good, and thereby the child's being good, is an absolute value, which I should and ought to set as a goal for myself, even in a world in which there is no hope for achieving that end. Even there, it's an obligation. If I live according to this, then I'm good so far and do my duty. Moreover, that is and remains good, whatever the world still has, whether the world still has sense or not. So he kind of attributes to the mother this type of reflection. So however certain it may be that the world is about to destroy in a couple of minutes, so I can't achieve anything by my education of the child or my caring for the child. Still, I'm obliged to lovingly care for the child. And that remains my obligation, independently of the prospect of achieving anything. The mother is not a model of ethical agency or a paradigm of moral subjectivity for Husserl. That's not the point. She's an imaginary example that allows us to pay heed to a crucial difference of sense in certainties, characteristic of the two imperatives, the imperative to do the best possible and the commandment of love. Whereas the former is absolute in its form merely due to its lack of material specification, so the Brentanian rule of the best possible. The second one, so the commandment of love, is absolute in its verbal specificity and reference to the intentional activity of loving, with personal axiological and conative grounds. Whereas the first one commands us to compare the goods of our goals in terms of their possibilities of realization, the second one, the commandment of love, compares us to act lovingly, whatever comes, even if nothing comes out of it. So I think we can summarize Husserl's revision of Kantian imperative by saying that he started with Brentano and Brentanian formulations that regulate doing, willing, and acting, doing the best, but enrich these by rules that command us to be good, become good, to be good, and to become good. However, when his reflections on love proceeded, he realized the fundamental ethical significance of the commandment of love, and his investigations moved from conative imperatives of doing and willing and acting to, one could perhaps call it an axiological imperative or an emotive imperative of loving. Love your neighbor. Common sense thinking proposes that it is senseless to try to command emotions or order human subjects to have emotions and experience feelings, let alone dictate love. That's crazy in common sense. This is because emotions as feelings are taken to be merely passive, affective, and receptive states without any active engagement or agency on a part of the emotive subject. Against such common sense and popular scientific teachings, I believe that Husserl contends that in addition to their governing axiological moments, most emotions, if not all, also entail conative parts. In case of genuine love, the conative part, activated and guided by the axiological one, is rooted in the deepest core of the loving person, the ego. Thus, an imperative of loving is not only meaningful, but also necessary. Deeply personal love essentially entails a conative act founded on the axiological one, by which a subject commits herself and dedicates her life to the promotion of valued object, its happiness, its goodness, its beauty, and its development, if there is time for that. Moreover, personal values of love tie us together as axiological subject. And here I think the idea of the community of love comes in concretion, and I will end soon. So they tie us as axiological subjects capable of valuing in absolute unconditional manner, so loving. And in two ways. On the one hand, we are bound to mutual relations of care to all others who personally value what we value. So who love the same as we. Be it a friend, a child, a country, a nation, a field of arts, or one of the sciences. Like we here, for example, are bound by our love for philosophy. And it can be different in different cases, but it all has this similarity, and it brings us together. On the other hand, I think this is even more interesting, I think, in his Gränsproblem. We are also bound by relations of care to any person who is able to love something in a structurally similar manner as we love our beloved ones. So the structure of loving from one's cause and in this deeply egoic manner, drawing endless sources of feeling from from one's core, and then guiding one's will by this love. If we find similar loving in somebody else, even if the object is very different, we are bound to love him or her because of the structural similarity. We may not love the same objects that our fellow subjects love, but insofar as we ourselves are capable of valuing something deeply from the deepest cores of our intentional lives, we may be able to identify similar valuations in others and relate to them in empathy, in sympathy, and finally in loving care. I show you one still. And before that, this was the example of two kinds of agent in a dystopic world. So here is the father, John, and here is the aunt, Justine, and the mother, I didn't find the picture. In any case, there's a mother and a child and an aunt and a father, and the kind of Brentanian father commits a suicide in a stable with horses because he can't find anything that he can do for the bettering of the situation. And the mother kind of is ambivalent, I think, and perhaps a little aesthetic too. But the aunt then builds this symbolic protection for the mother and the child, which is kind of this concretization of an act of love in the last minutes, where nothing really can be done except to give the symbol of love to the two beloved ones. So this was just to concretize his example, his case study. But I show you one final quote, and this is from the manuscript, and I quote it from Sophie Lloyd's essay. And this just shows us how he thinks that we can also relate to others who love differently in terms of objects, but love similarly in terms of structure. Of course, the fulfillment of the personal absolute thought is an originally lived experience only for me, and as such preferred. But the law of love reigns here. As soon as I have the other given as a subject of her personal thought in empathy, I have to sympathize with her, love her, and to encourage and promote her is my absolute thought. So the love of the other lover is kind of inserted into the absolute love that has roots in my own egoic loves, which are specific and narrow. And I think here he kind of thinks is not a mechanism, but is a kind of way of connecting that can expand as a stoic circle of sympathy or sympathy and empathy. So I end here and hope that it wasn't either too trivial or too exhausting. And I thank you for your patience, of course.